Hello, good afternoon, and welcome new listeners and our returning listeners. Thank you very much for joining us on the Agile Matrix podcast. And today we have this very special guest, very special guest. We have none other than Joey Spooner. He is the Vice President for Community Development and Product Management at the Kanban University. And he's going to spend some time with us, talk about his experience with the Kanban method, some advice for people that are using Kanban, looking at how what a Kanban coach does, and looking at how you can actually use the Kanban method effectively, right, in your organization. Also, even addressing the questions: what does a CEO or CTO expect to get in using the Kanban method? What do you at that level want to see, or what can you see using the Kanban method? So stick with us. Like I said, this is the Agile Matrix podcast. And like I always say, grab your pen, grab your paper, grab your favorite beverage, and stay tuned to learn a lot from Joey Spooner on today's episode of the Agile Matrix podcast. And if you haven't subscribed, subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast application on YouTube. So stay tuned for more episodes of intriguing information, knowledge, and experience from a lot of our wonderful guests. So this is Agile Matrix podcast. Stay tuned for more from Joey Spooner, the VP in Kanban University. Thank you very much. So thank you very much. We're here at Agile Matrix Podcast, and we're here with the Vice President of Communications at the Kanban University, which is Joey Spooner. So thank you, Joey, for joining us for today's episode. Could you introduce yourself to our listeners and to our viewers?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Timmy. My name is Joey Spooner. I'm the Vice President of Community Development and Product Management at Kanban University. So I split my time between making sure our community is growing, that they're engaged, but also making products that really matter in the marketplace that help solve people's problems ultimately when they're trying to manage things better ultimately. So that's just a little bit about me. I've been doing this for the past, 15 years, 20 years now. I started off in software development, built video conferencing software, much like we're using today. That was my first job out of college, which was really fun. But, I've learned a lot along the way because that company lasted for 3 months. They were a startup. They didn't use any kind of disciplined approach, and they kind of just fell by the wayside. But I've worked in higher education as well to see how they manage things, to see how they work together with limited resources, how to get the most out of the least. That's one of the things I tend to look at. And then later on, I went to go work for nonprofits as well as government agencies, helping them to do something similar, right? Helping them to become stable, predictable, even reduce the amount of time it takes to get things done. So they actually save money on projects. That was something I was pretty good at doing. And so now I've been out in the past, I'd say 5 to 6 years, maybe a little bit more, teaching what the Kanban method is to people so they understand how to use it in their space, how they can make sense of it, how they can make good decisions with it from the executive level all the way down to the team level. And that's just a little bit about me for the time that we have. But, well, I'm sure we'll learn more as we talk here.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And yes, we will. And there's something you said that it's interesting that when I talk to people, I usually say, as a scrum master, team lead, whatever, I always pick out 3 things I should be looking out for. And you mentioned one. I always say, try to build effective, efficient, and reliable teams. So when you mentioned about great minds think alike. I think I can call myself a great mind today. So thank you very much for that. So you mentioned you've been doing this for 15, 20 years. So what has the experience been like? How you do get into the Kanban method, and how has it been so far?
That's a funny story. So I got into the Kanban method totally by accident. At the time, I was with my spouse, and she was studying for her PhD in music history at a local bookstore in an area near Florida. And I always perused books looking for better ways to learn about how to manage software development teams. So at this time, my job was managing a very small team of people, mostly part-timers, to build software for an educational organization. So I'm reading through books, and I stumbled onto this book called Agile Management. I'm like, what is this thing? It's like economics and software. I kind of like it. It's kind of hitting the sweet spot in my brain for like, how do you make sense of good use of time and energy, and what are the options on the table to do that? And the guy who wrote that book was David Anderson. So I thought, okay, that's pretty
Wow.
cool. Just totally random. I thought, okay, I'll just keep reading this. And about a couple of months later, I had an invitation to go out and give a presentation at Microsoft for a content management system I had built in .NET for this educational organization I worked for. And I fly out there, and I'm still reading this book, and I'm like, this is complex but fun stuff. And I'm like, who's this guy who wrote this again? Where is he? And I'm like, oh, this guy's name's David, and he actually works at Microsoft. I was like, what are the chances he's there when I'm there? So I literally do my presentation, finish that, walk outside the door, look to my right and go, that building. And I just walk over to a random building on Microsoft campus. And lo and behold, he was in that building, and they brought him down to talk with me, and then we became friends and talked, and we just kind of kept in touch
Wow.
ever since. Yeah. So
Wow.
that's my origin story for Kanban. So I kept I got involved with the community just by total chance, and kept learning and
Wow.
kind of playing around. My favorite experience was like 2 months later because of what I dealt with. I always had to deal with smaller teams and smaller number of people. So at one
Mm.
point I had what was effectively what you would call 2.5 full-time employees. So really 5 people. So
Yeah, part-time, man.
because they were part-time ultimately. And I put a message on a listserv one time that David had run for Kanban on a Yahoo group. And I said, how do you manage that? How do you make decisions with that? And people came back very quickly saying, well, what half of the person do you have? The bottom half or the top half? That's going to make a big difference, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, that was a little bit of my starting with the Kanban community and sort of like David and
Wow.
what he was researching. Yeah,
Wow, wow. You have a more interesting start. My start was simply I got into Kanban because after being a Scrum Master for a while, I got tired of velocity, got tired of basically I got tired. So the way my mind works, if I'm doing something, I'm always thinking about the next level.
sure.
So I looked at myself as a Scrum Master. I was thinking, what's the next level above? How can I take my teams to the next level? I looked at retrospectives, very fantastic, but asking the three questions in 20 different ways was kind of like tiring. How will I
Mm-hmm.
know my team is getting better? Because the velocity will go up and down based on the context, familiarity. So I couldn't use that as a metric on its own. So then I heard about flow metrics and I'm like, oh, where's this coming from? Then I heard about the Kanban Management Professional course and I was like, okay, there is yeah, where do I pay? Because I looked at the course outline. I was like, okay, where do I pay for this? Because I was like, I have to have this.
Yeah.
And that course was, if I say it was a mind blowing experience, I'm minimizing the impact. I left that course, and in the next 3 months, I was able to almost quadruple our the team's productivity, our outputs.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, I think we went out to about one third of our cycle time in that same 3 month period. I just took what I learned and it was, I think, and the thing I loved about the Kanban method, and I still love about it was, I didn't need to tell anyone. I didn't need to get any approval. It was something I could do locally with the team.
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know so I went to the team. We talked about limiting work in progress, talked about monitoring the aging whip and all those little things, and it was like night and day. The team just changed, and I looked at the guys. We're still the same people, but we're so much more effective. And that's what got me to the camera. That's what got me to saying I wanted to be a trainer, to do this, to do that. Because I like it. I keep saying this, but it sounds. I'm sure you have the same feeling. It works.
Well,
That's the thing. It works.
it works, but it's confusing to a lot of people because they're like, "Well, how does it work?" I'm not telling someone how to do their job better. No, you're not talking to people about how they can do testing better or development better. That may come about through what we call knowledge discovery or something along those lines, right? Where you're thinking about
Mm,
how do we improve the way we do our work, but that's a team's job to figure that out. As a manager or a scrum master, really the opportunity is there for you to say, well, how do we manage this stuff better? And what are the techniques for managing the work through policies effectively? So
yeah.
you with the whip limits, you with other things like that, what you did, you effectively introduced some local policies and people go, yeah, I think we can do that. Or let's play with it and see what we can learn about how we manage if we can't do that. Why is it that we can't succeed that way? So it's a whole discovery process around how you manage your work that comes about when you're using the Kanban method. And it's super
Mm,
fun stuff, especially when you just say, hey, let's try something. That's how I did the government agency that reduced its lead time by 90%. It had zero
wow.
defects, right? And people go, oh, you could never do that. If you talk about the outcome being the ideal thing, you go, well, no, we're not chasing that. What we're chasing is how we learn, how we manage,
Hmm.
and how we improve. And when you play in that space, you can do really great things relatively quickly. We're talking like a 90% reduction in lead time in less than 13 sprints. So, I mean,
Wow.
yeah, that can happen if you're paying attention to
Hmm.
what really matters. Yeah,
Yeah.
right. It's the fun part of this stuff.
I like that. Yeah, and I think there's something they said that's really powerful. If you're paying attention to the right stuff,
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
that's what I've observed that Kanban does. It points. In fact, I tell people that Agile is a wonderful tool for solving problems, but it points at the problems. If you're able to use it properly, it actually would expose and say, that's where, like we say about theory of constraints, right? It shows you
Mhm.
that constraint. And if you have the courage and boldness to deal with it. But I always tell people that what I love the Kanban method, that it goes one step further, which is We have evidence-based guidance to say this is the best to solve that issue. This is the best to solve that issue. This is the best to solve that issue. As opposed
Sure.
to, because like I had a podcast recording with someone and he mentioned something that really struck me. It was like some of these things that we talk about, the Scrum guy doesn't explicitly say, but an experienced Scrum Master will know what to do. And I was like, yeah, but you're leaving. It was Al Shalaway that said something. He said
Mm,
that the point that Scrum kind of like gives is the situation where you have to kind of like follow it to understand what to do. You have to follow it through and then get there and go, aha, eureka, I know what to do. But he was saying there has to be a more, I won't say more directive, but there has to be some guidance, a bit more guidance to go looking at the industries and experience. These are some of the things that we've seen that work. So,
mhm.
like you rightly said, you try something and see if it works. But to leave it to go, let's see where it sticks. It's kind of risky when you consider the fact that people are paying for this service, for this coaching, and also expecting something at the end of it, if it's a product or an improved, something at the end of it anyway. Money is going in and something must come out of it. So
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
yeah.
Well, and that's the fun part of this stuff, by the way. This is the hard part. That when
Mm,
you're really doing this, when you're doing this kind of work in the Kanban method, right? You have certain things you'll know, right? Pragmatic evidence-based guidance that says, "Hey, try this, try that," but you have to get everybody comfortable with the idea of we're going to learn because who knows, right?
yeah.
Sometimes the variability in your environment is different than other environments. Therefore, we're going to have to figure out
Mm,
two things. We're going to figure out, can we learn? Can we actually have a meaningful conversation? And then can we act on the information that we're learning about and then change how we're doing something? That's the hard part, honestly. Um, yeah, that's 90% of what I spend my time doing is looking at resistance to change and how we address that. Yeah,
yeah. Yeah. Perfect. Perfect. Thanks for
yeah.
that. So I have one question in my head. You've been doing this for over 15, 20 years, thereabout. Can you tell us your most, well, I say most interesting experience using the Kanban method and how you, when I say interesting, I obviously mean complicated and, filled with riddled issues. How are you able to move from one stage, it being all over the place and using the Kanban method to then make things better? And what did you get at the end of it?
Gosh, that's a good question. Um, hmm.
Mm,
So I would say probably the most. So I use Kanban. Let me give you my whole story here around how I've applied
mm,
Kanban, because that may give you a better insight into why I give you this answer. But on the when I started out with Kanban, when David published his first blue book, I said, okay, I'm going to give it a try. What I came up with was effectively what we call aggregated personal Kanban. Each person had a swim lane, everyone had the same workflow, and we were a small team, and we thought that would work right. But when I left that job after about a year or so, they said, "Can we erase the board?" And I was like, "Yeah, you can if you want to." And that told me I didn't set it up right for them to address their problems. It was me
mm.
and my problem, not their problem. So that was lesson number one. Then I took it to a nonprofit and we migrated over 20,000 pages of content using Kanban to track all that migration work with about probably 40 or 50 people working for like 3 weeks
Wow.
constantly, right? And I got to have a better idea of how flow worked, where bottlenecks existed, how to expedite and resolve bottlenecks. That was pretty fun to do. But then when I went to the Department of Labor, that's where the rubber hit the road. And I said, I want to find something that's all over the place and bring it back into a balanced, predictable manner. And I
Mm.
didn't know if I could do it, but I was looking for that dumpster fire effectively. And so I found it. I found one where it was like, oh, that's all the conditions are right. The leader wants to change the situation.
Mm.
The environment's ready for change, but the people are resisting change. It had a lot of the elements that looked good to me. And so I gave it a go there. And that's the one over like 13 cycles and a little bit more. They had Scrum, but not completely what you'd call all of Scrum. And there's nothing wrong
Mm.
with that. They just simply couldn't lift up the entire framework and utilize it, which is something I find happens here and there. So I helped them to utilize what they could and then add in Kanban to manage the rest. And it seemed to have worked pretty well for them, to the point that they got an award for performance. They got an award for getting the
Oh,
quality right.
nice.
They actually delivered something on time for the White House. So there's a lot of like pluses there as we did the work. And we're talking nothing fancy here, by the way, Timmy. We're talking like limiting work in progress, setting up some
Mm.
classes of service, and managing the flow where the bottlenecks showed up or where the delays showed up, using the
Mm.
metrics to kind of tell us where do we need to pay attention, how do we deal with those things, right? We got to the point where we were cross-training QAs and BAs together. We got it to where we knew our requirements weren't quite right. So we started doing some more upstream research and upstream development before we left the
Okay.
engagement.
Mm-hmm.
So those were kind of the things that happened. But I would say that in terms of your question, where it gets to be really interesting, kind of, oh, wow, and just kind of chaotic, that was a good one, right? That was proof that I could do this well at a
Yeah.
government agency. But then I went to go work for a couple of different organizations. I consulted after that across the US. And there was one organization that did health insurance that caught my attention because they were trying to do so much transformative stuff that they were actually putting themselves into chaos. So they had
Mm.
so much change going on to try and do all the good things. They were effectively creating chaos for the employees. And some employees whispered in my ears, they're like, I would love to help you, but I'm taking time off to actually get my work done. And I was like, oh,
Wow.
that's this kind of environment. And it was challenging, but I spent probably 6 months to 9 months with them before the contract wrapped up. And I remember really making an influence on some of their managers and leaders there. And I've been checking in with them from time to time because I kind of treat things like gardens. I always go back and kind of tend to them and see how they're doing. Even if they don't let me play in the dirt, I'll just kind of want to know. And lo and behold, they are starting to really pave some good pathways in front of them. We're talking like saving millions of dollars for the organization by using the tools we gave them to understand how flow works in their environment of like 300 teams. So they
Mm.
started to realize, wait a minute, we can save money over here. We can actually argue that this system being down all the time is costing us this much in terms of labor cost. And now we have a way to quantify that with what we learned in the Kanban method. And it was a
Mm.
big number. And they said, okay, if we can take this to our leadership, they might say, well, let's fix that testing system. Sure enough, the leadership said, when can we schedule the time to actually get that thing fixed, right?
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
they're losing hand over fist money and they didn't know it. And there's lots of
Mm.
waste. Still today, there's lots of waste in systems, bigger, larger systems like this with 300 teams or more, where you can
Yeah.
simply see the sore thumb and go, well, if you fix that, we'll save money. The next thing
Hmm.
that they're playing with now is, I think, something around release management, I think it is. And they're trying to figure out how to get releases done in a smoother, timely fashion because they're showing the holding cost of holding that inventory up before it
Mm.
goes out the door. And this is a Kanban thing to the people who are listening. And
Yeah, yeah.
inventory is something we pay attention to, right? Because
Hmm.
knowledge work is ultimately inventory from raw material, not quite sure what the thing is, to actually having it built as software or whatever it might be. And it's ready to go out to the consumer. And so they're holding so much back that it's actually costing this firm like similar multiple millions of dollars to hold this inventory
Wow.
there. And they're going, guys, if we don't release this, we're effectively just keeping it as a liability on the books. We should probably do something to make it into an asset, right? So they're getting close to making a good case. We're talking like big money here that matters to CTOs, that matters to CEOs, that matters to like CFOs. They're going, okay, we can move this across the balance sheet and probably make this into an asset. Hopefully that's what they want to do. Depending on how you run your business, you might want to keep it as a
Mm.
liability,
Mm.
but it depends, right? But that's highlighting the fact of how these people are becoming more and more aware of taking something that's completely chaotic and orchestrating an understanding of the context such that when
Yeah.
it gets to the executives, they go, oh, this actually has a dollar and cents impact on me. And
Hmm.
we go, yeah, we're
Hmm.
talking like usually the numbers we play with are at the minimum $250,000 to maybe $500,000, depending on the teams that are
Wow.
involved, right? When
Hmm.
you work with Kanban, you may not realize it, but you're playing with that context regularly.
Yeah.
So that's where it's really fun stuff for me because I love what we do in the Kanban method. I love all the stuff that we taught you, Timmy, and you teach students great as well. But
Thank you
really
for
the
that.
fun, yeah, the fun part is really when you get to the business and how does it impact the business or the
Mm.
organization, right? Be it a nonprofit or something. There's always some way to have a pretty significant economic impact when using what we teach people. If they start to understand how to assess it or they understand how to apply it. But yeah, to answer your question, that was probably the craziest one where I saw them take over the course of a few years, they took what we had and they made arguments at the multi-million-dollar level saying, if we solve these problems, we save lots of money. And they had a very good, clear, articulate argument for it. And we're not talking anything fancy, by the way. We're talking good
Yeah.
lead time analysis in
Hmm.
aggregate and having multiple views on that and being able to share that with leadership. And they go, oh, that might be worth fixing, right?
It's very true. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Do you know? I was telling someone was saying, "Oh, management take a while to make decisions." I was like, "Yeah, they do. If you don't speak in their language, if
right.
you tell them it's costing you $1 million a month, they'll make it straight. When you
Well,
tell them, oh, it's
yeah,
costing us 2 days of cycle time, they're like, it's not
yeah.
actually
Time,
information. Yeah.
right. Time is fungible at that point. So it's a matter of being able to articulate things and back them up, right? Be able to say, I think this is the right argument, right? I think these
Mm.
are the right numbers. Because even the people I work with now who do those numbers, they're a little bit off. And I'm trying to say, well, is that the language that the company speaks and they understand it? Or is it that you need to be really accurate? Because if you're accurate, you're playing with apples and oranges. And I'm trying to help them to sort
Mm.
that out, right? And so that's what it takes is understanding what data you're working with to know that you're making some good informed analysis that you can bring to other managers to say, I think we might need to change X, right? And
Mm.
that's the fun part. When you're playing with Kanban, you can play with it at scale and say, well, across 300 teams, how does this look? You can take it right down to the team level and say, how do we improve the local area for this team, right? The flow,
Yeah.
the demand, whatever it is. So a lot of people get confused by that. They don't, it's hard to understand that you can apply these concepts at different parts of the
Different.
organizational
Yeah.
scale
Mm-hmm.
within a matter of minutes, right? It's like years ago, I was at an archive and I saw a lady who ran the archive speak, I think it was German, French, Japanese, and English, all in the span of like less than 5 minutes, probably 2 minutes.
Wow.
Yeah, and I was just sitting there going, "Whoa!" But someone who's trained in Kanban really well can ultimately, speak to that team level, to the
Mm-hmm.
managerial level, and then to the leadership level relatively quickly in their own language that makes sense to them, like you're talking about.
Yeah.
Like a good Kanban coach can definitely do that. If they really have been practicing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Oh, you touched on something that I was thinking about. So, how do I do this internally? Okay, so two things I'm thinking about, right? One
yeah,
question is, I'm a CTO, I'm a CEO, I'm a CFO. I've heard
hmm,
about Kanban. I've heard a lot of people talk about Scrum teams and all that, but they're local. They're 3 to 5 stages below me.
sure,
Now I have someone telling me, "Oh, Agile will work for me." What do I expect? What can I see? How will I make it work? So that's question one. Then
sure,
question two for you, if we can, is I was talking to some people a couple of minutes ago, and I was trying to differentiate the difference between what a Kanban coach does. Like in other words, saying to them that a Kanban coach is like a sports coach. He
hmm,
comes in to help the organization. He doesn't just come in to help the team. When you bring a Kanban coach in, you are saying as an organization, what can we do to be better? So
yeah,
what do you say to the first part, which is CFO, CEO, why do I do these things?
yeah. So a CFO, XO level, basically, um, to be blunt about it, they could care less about Agile from what I've seen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Uh, they're simple business people, good business people, honestly. And they're looking at the business model. They're looking at the basic AR, AP type things. They're trying to pay attention to how the business is running. What are our expenses like? How do we get customer growth? How do we get revenue growth? The good, healthy, basic things that you want to pay attention to. And they're trying to figure out how to finance this as well, just like anybody else,
Mm.
depending on where they sit, right? So a CTO might have more of a job of, I've got things being thrown over the fence at me, and I've got to deliver them back to the customers inside the business as well as I can, right?
Yeah.
So for them sitting where they are, they're probably going to say, I need predictability. I need some level of control. I need some way to handle exceptions. And to some degree, that's what Kanban does really well.
Mm-hmm.
But it does require changing how you look at things from the XO level. So a lot of XOs tend to look at things from, I love this phrase, and I'm going to use his name because he said it and it's recorded somewhere. Steve Ballmer. Steve Ballmer at one point said, you got to control your controllables. And there's
Okay.
nothing wrong with that. But it does give me an indication of, like, most executives tend to look at things of, well, how do I control things so we don't get too much variability in the environment? Such that a CTO says, well, how do I get what I need to control? And the tools they use for control are kind of old, not old, but they're just good, old fashioned. They've always worked command and control type tools. They're great.
Mm.
Really, they are. But they don't open up the door for what you would need to actually execute effectively in an agile environment. And when I mean agile environment, I mean primarily adaptable. A
Yeah.
lot of people have different words for what agile is. For me, agile is being adaptable to the changing circumstances in your
Mm-hmm.
environment.
Mm-hmm.
And you can do a lot with that. And that's why, in the background of Kanban, there's lean, because lean's actually allowing you to say, let's make good decisions, not take on too much work and learn in the process, right? There's a
Yeah.
lot that goes on there. So if I'm a CTO and I want to say, what is in it for me with Kanban, it's going to be that you have better data coming out of your environment, more accurate data that tells you in a more timely fashion where things might be going. In fact, you might even get some leading indicators rather than lagging indicators on the
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
performance of multiple areas of your organization. Uh, and it allows you to know, are we going in the right direction, or is something going off course a little bit? Relatively quickly. Like, we know this from the training that we've done, but I think for CTOs to be able to say, I can look at a dashboard and tell now if we're going to be off schedule 6 months from now, yeah, you
Mm.
probably can, depending on how the team is operating and what the organizational structure is. There are ways to really discover this pretty quickly. And also to tell, how much are we going to potentially burn out, like in additional capital. So rather than trying to control for a given bucket of cash, you already know within like a month or so if you're going to be 6 months off schedule, theoretically, right? Depending on the project. And that allows you and the rest of your portfolio team and everyone else to say, oh, we have to course correct here or change scope or something else. So it gives you a chance to kind of do an early indication system, almost like radar for
Yeah.
projects. It's kind of like you're seeing it come at you and go, oh, wait, we got to change already. And that's pretty normal for a lot of organizations to be able to say we have to change, but to be able to change earlier, more proactively is one thing that I think
Yeah.
is really helpful.
Mm.
So for a CTO, that's pretty powerful stuff. And also, from a CTO's perspective and a lot of XO perspectives, they like to reorganize for a number of reasons. And if you're capturing what we capture now within the Kanban method for these groups that are inside your business, you can capture the before and after. You can actually start to see the impact of change on your organization. And you can see how it's affecting your capability or possibly
Mm.
or negatively, right? Because sometimes they're not wrong to reorganize. Like we know there's what we call the punctuation point where the
Yeah.
executive goes, enough's enough, let's reorganize, right? And they're not wrong to do that. But you can
Mm.
actually start to see how that performance changes. And
Mm.
that's qualitative and quantitative. So I think for an executive, it's a pretty good set of data to work with and indicators on how things are improving or not improving in your organization. Probably for executives, one of the biggest bangs I've seen happen so far, and this was at a telco inside a large energy company. No one had sat down in a room and said, okay, well, how are we all getting serviced by this one primary outside provider? No one has sat down, and these were like 100 people who ran 100 teams. No one has sat down and said, well, how are things working for us with this one contractor? We always go back
Mm.
to the contract office and complain, but has anyone sat down and looked at the impact of this contractor on the flow of your work and how it
Mm.
delays
Mm.
and what the
Mm.
cost of that delay might be? No one had ever done that. And so I think for the
Wow.
executive, they were like, oh, that's a thing. We're like, yeah, that's probably $500,000 to $2 million you can save through contract renegotiation over the course of maybe 13 months. Usually it's about 12 to 13 months for contract stuff. But that would have saved them a ton of money. They had never had that
Mm.
conversation before. And that's just one example of what you can get at an XO level from the Kanban method. Typically, you're going to save a few $1,000,000, honestly. And you can go up beyond that. Like I told you with this one other client I have is doing
Yeah.
probably, I can't say their numbers. I don't want to share that too loudly, but it's a good number, right?
It's
It's
a
a
good
good
number.
solid number. Yeah.
Mm.
So from the XO level, that's a pretty big deal. There was something else I think that you had a question on here that
About the
yeah,
Kanban coach.
yeah, the coach. So the coach thing, the metaphor is on the money, honestly. The coach's job is primarily to introduce stress, but it's a little bit of a delicate thing because oftentimes when people start to use Kanban, they think, well, we're going to get rid of the stress. And really, Kanban's there is to address the stress and maybe add stress. It's a really fascinating space for me right now because I'm paying attention to it a lot
Mm.
sociologically. But what typically happens is someone says, well, we're on fire or we're disorganized or whatever. We can't do X thing, whatever that approach or process might be. And they bring in Kanban to stabilize it a bit. And they feel really good about it, usually. And when it's not done well, and this is key thing for your listeners, if you're told there are only 3 practices of the Kanban method, then you're missing out. So one of the things I've run into a lot is that people who are trying to help out in getting Kanban into organizations
Mm.
are halfway there, honestly. They're not bad people, they're just halfway there with the Kanban method. So they're introducing what are called the operational practices, which are visualization, limiting WIP, and managing flow to some degree, right? And trying to use
Yeah.
I hate to say it, but they're trying to use quasi flow metrics. They're not using really the best metrics. But what's missing even more so is the fact that they're missing out on policies that we introduce or they need to introduce,
Mm.
making them explicit. They're missing out on basically experimenting and collaborating and feedback loops. And so
Yeah.
those are what we call our managerial practices in the Kanban method. And people often miss out on those things. That's what really gives it the juice that has the good stories that people go, oh, I want that. But oftentimes people think if we can just do these 3 practices, we'll be let alone, right? Because there's so much stress in our environment already. We don't
Mm.
need to be doing more, whatever this is. Because, for example, I'll pick on Scrum because it's often abused, honestly. We've been
Yeah.
told to do Scrum and we've been beaten down in the dirt. If we're not doing Scrum this way, we're not doing it at all. And you've got to comply, right? And this is mostly organizational behavior, by the way. I have nothing
Mm.
against Scrum, but it's just the way it's misused, right? Any good
Yeah.
concept turns into a hammer sometimes inside organizations. So when it comes to coaching, oftentimes what I try to teach coaches is the first thing is, what stress do you have to resolve right now? You've got to get people to a place where they don't feel as stressed as they did before. That
Mm.
means that means using what they already know, right? Sometimes we call this static, which is a systems thinking approach in introducing Kanban.
Kanban, yeah.
The first step's the most valuable step. What are your sources of dissatisfaction? What's going
Mm.
on that's really causing pain? And let's figure out how to address that first. That can take 6 weeks to 6 months, depending on the environment and what's going on. And that what comes out of that is a stable, predictable team to some degree. They may have some issues, but they're getting better at what they're doing. They may be less customer focused, but now they're more customer focused a little bit. So
Yeah.
it depends on the context. But let's say that the coach gets them to a place where they're operating a little bit less stressed. Then the coach's job is to say, well, this is where you are. Maybe you're at like what we call maturity level 1, which is a team level of maturity. Nothing wrong with that. Really good, honestly. But what's next after that is being customer focused. Well, that's a stressor. How do we introduce the customer into our conversations? Right? I've had government people say, "You will never talk to the customer. You will never do that." Right? Oh yeah, yeah, it
Oh,
happens.
wow.
And in some organizations that are really big, like cloud-based organizations, they just
Mm.
simply can't talk to the customer. They have too many of them. Is that to do something different? But that's the next step, is to kind of say, let's orient to our customer and grow. But that's a stressor that the coach has to introduce in a very thoughtful way to say, let's experiment and learn how we do that. So
Yeah.
the fact that you talk to your customer is a good thing. But the coach hopefully is really after saying, well, how do we learn? How do we start to get comfortable with the idea of learning and start to try out new things? A new thing is saying, well, maybe we can put out a customer request form or something else like that, depending on your context, right? That engages the customer. Maybe it's a
Mm.
feedback form, right? We use fit for purpose in Kanban. Maybe it's a feedback form that tells us if we're fit for purpose so far.
Yeah.
And yeah, we don't really have a dialogue yet with our customer, but we're getting there piece by piece.
Yeah.
And
We're starting
that's
to
partly,
look. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, and that's partly where the coach really should be taking a peek at their own knowledge, but also our body of knowledge as well in the maturity model, to say, what are the tools out there that maybe I could throw in here and maybe add this in as an experiment for the team to try possibly. Uh,
Mm.
that's at least a decent start for a coach. And that's where a coach actually is much like a sports coach. They're saying, well, now
Yeah.
you're doing 100 pounds of weight. We're going to put 120 pounds of weight on you and see
More.
how it works now. Yeah.
Hmm.
And that's basically just helping you to get better and more resilient in the context that you're in. So you could
Yeah.
be chaotic, but now you're more resilient as a team. Now you're going to talk to your customer. How do you work with your customer? Now you're becoming more resilient with your customer and engaging with them. So you're developing that robustness, that resilience that we talk about a lot, piece by piece.
Yeah. Yeah. A question. You've been doing this for about 20 years.
Yeah.
If you had a chance to go back to Joey 20 years ago, even though looking at you look like a day above 25. So anyway. So if you could go back to Joey 20 years ago, what would you tell Joey, knowing what you know now within the Kanban method, within Agile value delivery? What would you tell?
Well, first I'd tell them to invest in crypto. Just take 20 bucks out and buy crypto.
You and me both.
Man, that was a surprise. You know, I would say in terms of Kanban and what I did with it, probably if I'm being really pragmatic about it, the one thing that I have learned over the years, it's a common human fault, especially for guys, honestly, is that we tend to over solutionize. We tend to say, well, here's
Mm,
the answer. So if I had to go back to myself, I'd say, take it easy, let it cook, right? Figure out the problem, but make sure that everyone agrees on the problem before you provide the solution that you might have in your head. Because
mm,
oftentimes, the biggest mistake I have made early on in my 20s, honestly, this was a bigger problem, is that I'd say, well, here's the answer. Just that's the answer, right, guys? Why don't we just go ahead and do that, right? And
kinda.
oftentimes people are like, no, that's not the answer. We don't agree with that. And so if I were to tell people and tell myself even something right now, is to be very mindful of what overreaching looks like. Overreaching is where you say, well, here's the next thing we need to go to. It's very logical. And we don't need to do this other stuff to get there. We just need to go ahead and start doing this higher level or more mature thing, and we'll just be okay. And that's what happened in my first time using Kanban back in my probably late 20s, early 30s, I guess. Yeah. And so that would have been like the time where I would have gone back and whispered in my ear, slow down, capture their pain, understand what the problem is that they have, get a mutual
Mm,
alignment on the problem before we even think about providing any kind of answer to this stuff.
mm, mm.
Because if not, then it's your answer, your problem, your solution,
Yeah.
and they're just there along for the ride. And that can happen. I hate to say that with coaches, leaders, thought leaders in particular. I was talking about someone today that is kind of adjacent to our community, and there's a bit of narcissism out there, unfortunately. And if you let that narcissism drive your coaching, that you think you know it all and you have all the answers,
Yeah.
you're always going to
Yeah.
run into problems. Yeah.
Mm.
And that can be out of fear or whatever, but you've got to be able to slow down and say, okay, we can sit here with this problem and define it before we simply move on
Before,
to
yeah.
solution. Yeah.
Okay, okay, perfect. Thank you for that. And then
Yeah.
finally, you have some Scrum Masters, Agile coaches, Kanban aficionados listening to you. What will your final statement to them be? Either a word of encouragement or I don't.
Yeah. I know the market can be tough right now. I know a lot of coaches are like, and for good reason. I mean, there's a lot of companies that have backed away from investing in Agile, but I think what you're going to find is that things change over the next 12 months or so. That's my hope,
Mhm.
at least. So I would say, stay sharp, learn as much as you can. Tune into like Timmy's podcast. We have other great podcasts as well, I'm sure, out there, but Timmy's a great one.
Thank you.
But yeah, I think this is a good time. For example, years ago, when the housing bubble burst and the markets
Mm.
crashed and all that stuff, I found myself reading .NET and learning how to program C sharp and just doing it from home, right, without a computer, because that was what I had at the time. So this is a good time to learn. Honestly, this is a great time to get that additional education that you might need
Yeah.
to help you get ready for what's coming. And I do believe that there's another like probably pull in the market forthcoming, hopefully next quarter or Q1 of 25, I hope. But it's hard to predict the tea leaves on that kind of stuff. But right now,
Mm.
I would say, if anything, stay focused on the business that you work for, get into the value stream, actually help to improve the business economically, like the people I
Mm.
told you about. If you're
Yeah.
not doing that and you're just running ceremonies, which, there's nothing wrong with running ceremonies, but when you run ceremonies, you're just an expense on a balance sheet. If you're actually adding value back to the business and helping them save money or make money, now
Mm.
you're providing real value. So however you can do that, it's really going to matter in the future, even for new work right now. I think you're helping a team, but how are you helping a team to even do better with the work that they're doing, and not just simply having good conversations, right? You got to actually be part of that feedback loop.
Yeah.
That's the fun stuff, honestly, if you can do it.
No, perfect. Thank you so
Yeah.
very much. I think that there's something you said that I really, that in fact, I had a recording earlier today, and that's what the person said actually, that the ceremonies are one thing, but they are a means to an end. Provide that value. It's to then
Hmm.
validate the ceremonies you're doing or the events. Because if not, like you said, if I'm looking at the balance sheet, I'm thinking, where can I cut cost? And I have this
Yeah.
ceremony secretary. Yeah, I cut it off.
Yeah.
But if the guy's providing value, I need the guy.
Yeah, and honestly, just a small plug. Our Scrum Better with Kanban course, if you're doing Scrum right now, even if you're not doing Scrum, you'll probably learn a ton about how we look at problems in the Kanban space and then how we look at change in the Kanban space. And
Mm,
that change piece is what we call the feedback loop. We point out the loop piece because there's a feedback element that always happens with teams. This is working good, this isn't working good. But that
mm,
loop piece is like, okay, now let's act on that, right? And that's what we call an act of leadership in the Kanban method. And that's
yes.
a huge deal. So I think,
Mm,
for people who are taking classes from you that want to learn more about this, they should take a look at the Scrum Better with Kanban course, because really it will open up the door for them to go, oh, these are ways I can find problems without having to even use metrics. These are problems that are just simply right there on the surface. And then here are the potential ways to solve those problems, or at least help the team learn how to solve those problems, build morale, save money, save time, improve quality. I mean, all this comes together in the course of like a 1 day training from the Kanban method people. So yeah, that's my little plug for the course there, Timmy. I think it's
yeah.
super valuable. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Joey.
You're
So
welcome.
you've heard it, you've heard Joey. In the show notes, I'll put Joey's contacts information there. I'll also put the Kanban University links, and you see the Scrum Better or Kanban links as well. So thank you
Awesome.
very much, Joey. I know you're pressed for time. I'm really honored that you spent time with us today.
Yeah.
It's not, it's, I mean, this is Joey Spooner we're talking about here. So thank you so very much. Wow, wow, wow. And there you have it. Fantastic conversation with Joey Spooner there. I can't thank Joey enough, because in the midst of his busy schedule, he's taking time to speak to our listeners. So I hope you learned something from Joey about how to apply the Kanban method and the importance of some of the metrics we talk about in the Kanban method, and actually how you can drive value, and how you can, with the Kanban method, make yourself more valuable in the organization you work with. So thank you very much for staying tuned to that episode. And what I'll say is, if you're not subscribed, subscribe. And if you want to support this show, you can. Our Patreon links are in the description, in the show notes. And like I said, I'll put Joey's show, information there. I'll put the information for the Kanban courses and all on the show notes. So this is the Agile Mysteries podcast with Tammy. So stay tuned, for we have more exciting episodes even coming your way. Remember, keep iterating, keep doing awesome stuff, keep learning, and keep adding value to your organization. So thank you very much for doing Adam Rich's podcast today, and have yourself a fantastic day. Cheers, everyone.